Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 30th edition of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And with all of the depressing and disturbing news, I thought we would start with something perhaps a little inspiring today. This is an article that's called, "I Thought I Would Be Caged My Whole Life," and it's by Alexandra Alter. Woody Brown knew he wanted to be a writer when he was 8 years old. Around that age, he made up stories about his alter ego, Cop Woody, a hero who went around saving people. The tales stunned his mother, Mary Brown. She'd been reading to him since he was a baby, but never imagined that he could create his own elaborate plots. As a toddler, Woody was diagnosed with severe autism. Doctors concluded he couldn't process language and said it was pointless to explain things to him or talk to him in complex sentences. Whenever Woody spoke, it sounded like shrieks and gibberish. But Mary came to realize that her son understood more than he appeared to. He would become hysterical if they deviated from their daily routine, but if she explained why they had to stop at Target before getting lunch at McDonald's, he would calmly follow her into the store. At 5, he learned to communicate by pointing at letters to spell out words, using a laminated card. He began responding to Mary's questions, first with single word answers and later with short sentences. When he started spelling out his Cop Woody stories, Mary recognized some of the plots which were lifted from the headlines. Woody had been following the news on TV and radio. That's how Mom figured out that I was listening to everything Woody told me when we met at a recent morning at his parents' home in Monrovia, California, where he lives. To express this, Woody tapped letters on a board with his right index finger, while Mary, who was seated next to him on the couch, followed his finger taps and repeated the words aloud. When he learned to communicate by spelling, it felt like an escape hatch had opened, Woody explained. Miraculous discovery, he spelled. I thought I would be caged my whole life, and then the door was opened, left ajar, not flung wide, because the majority of people still doubted me. After getting an English degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, from which he was the first nonverbal autistic person to graduate, Woody received a master's in creative writing from Columbia University. This month, he is publishing his debut novel, Upward Bound, which centers on the lives of disabled people in an adult daycare center in Southern California. The novel, which Woody spelled out at a rate of one paragraph a day, has drawn enthusiastic advanced reviews and praise from writers like Paul Beatty, Roddy Doyle, and Mona Simpson. Beatty, who was one of Woody's teachers at Columbia, said he was struck by the range of characters and voices in Upward Bound and how they build on one another like a chorus. The characters, I think like Woody himself, they all know what they want to say, he said. While not strictly autobiographical, the stories in Upward Bound are shaped by Woody's experience. He describes the agony of being unable to share his thoughts or control his verbal and physical tics, and the frustration of being underestimated by people who look at him and see an uncomprehending, mentally disabled person. I wanted to reach neurotypical readers, the well-intentioned people who don't realize that we are the same inside, he explained. I have all the thoughts, dreams, longings, and intelligence as any neurotypical person. I just present a little differently. On the morning we met, Woody and Mary and the family's two dogs, Morton and Brisket, greeted me at the front door of their home, which sits on a quiet street near the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. We spoke in half-hour intervals, the amount of time Woody could tolerate without getting too overwhelmed. Sitting in the living room, Woody often gazed at a rolling metal cart he kept by his side, which Mary calls his AV cart. It held two iPads and two laptops that played different shows he watches, including his favorite, Thomas and Friends, the animated kids show featuring talking trains. The collage of moving images looked chaotic and distracting, but it helps keep him calm, he explained. I have many channels running concurrently in my brain, he explained. If I try to narrow it down to one, the top of my head blows off. Being around Woody, I was struck by his self-possession and quick, decisive responses. When I asked what he hopes readers will take from his book, he answered without hesitating that I'm a really good writer and they can't wait for my next book. It was one of the few times he glanced at me out of the corner of his eye and smiled. At 28, Woody is unable to live independently. His small, bright, and tidy bedroom is full of toys and knickknacks he's loved since he was little. Mr. Potato Head, Legos, a large plastic track for his trains. On one wall, there's a riot of screens. A large flat screen was showing local news, and iPads and computer monitors played YouTube and animated movies. Thomas is almost always playing, along with one of the Toy Story movies. Woody is named after the movie's toy cowboy protagonist. On a desk in front of the television, he keeps his toy trains, which he lines up in precisely the same order that they appear in Thomas and Friends. Outside his bedroom, there's a wall of Woody's diplomas from Pasadena City College, UCLA, and Columbia. During our conversations, which took place over 2 days, Woody mostly stared at his screens or looked down at his lap or across the room or out the window into the garden where Morton, a gray poodle mix, was barking at a landscaper's leaf blower. It's hard to process what he's hearing while making eye contact, he explained. Sometimes he verbalizes through an involuntary repetition of words and utter phrases from movies and TV shows like Evil Dr. Porkchop or Blow the Whistle, Henry. Woody was born in Pasadena in late December 1997. Mary and Drew Brown had 2 young daughters in demanding jobs in entertainment. Mary worked as a story analyst for Hollywood studios, and Drew was a producer for television shows. So when Woody was 2, they enrolled him in daycare. Right away, the teachers told Drew and Mary that something was wrong with Woody, who was unresponsive to basic instructions. Tests showed that he was severely autistic. His doctors concluded he would likely never develop the ability to speak coherently or hold a conversation. Mary took Woody to speech therapy, play therapy, and occupational therapy, draining their savings. Nothing seemed to help. He couldn't be directed toward an activity and had obsessive compulsive behaviors, she said. He would line up his trains, which he still does. Some things haven't changed at all. During those years, before he could communicate, Woody felt isolated and overlooked. I could understand everything, but I couldn't tell them what I knew, he spelled, so they all assumed I was intellectually disabled. In 2003, when Woody was 5, the Browns learned of a woman named Soma Mukhopadhyay, who had developed a system to communicate with her nonverbal autistic son. Her technique taught children to express themselves by pointing at letters to spell out words, or by writing or typing. She worked in Los Angeles, and they started taking Woody to see her once a week for $25 a session. Mary learned how to use the letterboard with Woody, though she struggled at first to communicate smoothly. Mukhopadhyay recalls Woody as a bright and creative child and still remembers his stories about his heroic alter ego. He would look at himself as a cop in the story, Cop Woody, who would do all these superhuman things and save people's lives. Katie Annawalt, a speech-language pathologist who trained with her, said when she first watched Woody use the letterboard, she saw the tension evaporate when he was finally able to get a thought across. You can see his body relax, she said, and she's a family friend of the Browns who has worked with Woody over the years. Some of the communication methods Mukhopadhyay teaches have drawn criticism from language experts who argue that the person holding the board might be influencing or misinterpreting comments from a disabled person. The American Speech Language Hearing Association doesn't recommend the method and put out a statement in 2019 warning that the resulting words might not reflect the disabled person's intentions. There are also skeptics who doubt someone as severely autistic as Woody can form and express sophisticated thoughts, much less write a novel. Mary said she isn't surprised some people question his abilities. It took her years to recognize what he was capable of. But she bristles at critics who say the way they communicate is harmful or manipulative. How on earth am I harming him, she said. She's also faced questions over whether she's influencing or shaping Woody's writing, which she insists she isn't. When Woody is conversing, his finger flies across the board, but when he's writing, Mary makes him spell out each word slowly. He can also type on a keyboard, but he prefers to write with the letterboard because his poor fine motor skills make it hard to hit the right keys, and the time spent fixing typos makes him lose focus. When he's writing, Mary often reads sentences back to him multiple times to make sure she's captured them correctly. I ask, did I get it right? Do you want a comma or an em dash, she says. I didn't ever want my voice to creep in. Almost every phase of Woody's education was a struggle. In elementary school, he was frustrated in the special education track and prone to outbursts, occasionally throwing chairs. Teachers assumed that he couldn't keep up, and it was the opposite, Drew told me at their home. Imagine being stuck inside your head and being more intelligent than people give you credit for. College seemed out of reach. Mary worried Woody couldn't sit through long lectures without screeching or making a scene. Still, she couldn't accept the alternative, which was adult daycare. So Woody and his aide Sal, who helped him through high school, filled out an online application for Pasadena City College, not mentioning his disability. When Woody was accepted, they tried to find a full-time aide, but it was too expensive. So Mary accompanied him to class to facilitate. Woody excelled at community college and transferred into UCLA, where he took a creative writing class with the novelist Mona Simpson. He submitted a story called The Eloper about a nonverbal autistic man who wanders out of a daycare facility and is accosted by police officers. It became the opening of a longer work of nested stories set at a center for people with disabilities. It was such a persuasive view of a world that I hadn't seen before, Simpson said. In graduate school at Columbia, Woody continued to work on Upward Bound, which took around 2.5 years to write. His teachers and classmates quickly adjusted to Woody and his mom's presence. Mary attended classes as his communication aide, and his tendency to have an iPad playing with the sound on mute. He has an instinct for the natural shape of a story, said Rivka Galshin, one of Woody's Columbia professors, who saw early drafts of Upward Bound. His voice is so buoyant and kind and funny. The novel is partly autobiographical and partly an exploration of a grim alternative reality that Woody avoided. One of the main characters, Walter, a nonverbal autistic young man whose life mirrors Woody's in many ways, can't be left unsupervised at home and has to go to a daycare center. I had no way of letting people know who I was, and my exterior presentation led people to make demeaning assumptions about me, Walter reflects in the novel's opening chapter. My intelligence was like the rock pushed up the hill by Sisyphus. I could never get it to the top. Some stories come straight from Woody's life, like the night he punched through a living room window, distressed by what he felt was an insensitive portrayal of an autistic person in the TV movie Temple Grandin. A chapter titled Camp Cami describes his experience at a sleepaway camp for disabled people. His parents had to pick him up almost immediately after a counselor saw him clutching an empty pill container, which had been mistakenly left in the duffel bag he brought from home, and assumed he had overdosed. When they asked if he had swallowed the pills, Woody could only yell, "Henry," one of the trains from Thomas and Friends, which Woody calls out when he's distressed. On a recent Friday morning, Woody and Mary sat side by side at a desk in their small home office to work on his second book, Alfie, a novel about an autistic man who grows up trying to recapture the camaraderie he felt with a young baseball prodigy when they were children. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs before. Is that okay, Mary asked. Woody pointed to yes on the letterboard. Mary read the passages Woody had written the day before, describing how Alfie, the young baseball prodigy, doubted his athletic abilities and was racked with anxiety. Woody picked up the story. As he pointed to letters, Mary slowly read the words he spelled and typed them up. He kept it to himself, not wanting to disappoint his hovering parents. Mary held up a piece of paper that said end of paragraph on one end and keep going on the other. Woody tapped keep going. Little did he know that he was exactly the same as his outwardly placid father, Mary said as he tapped. The day before, as Woody and Mary and I sat in the living room, I asked him what it was like to imagine the inner lives of neurotypical people in Upward Bound. Along with autistic characters, the novel explores the perspectives of employees at the daycare center. Some are heroically devoted to the disabled people in their care. Others, through a failure of imagination or empathy, are unable to recognize their humanity. Woody's answer suggested that he thought it was a curious question. I live with neurotypical people and I've met many, he spelled. It wasn't difficult to imagine their lives and thoughts, whereas they have trouble imagining mine. And now back to, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an article, back to politics. Quote, I think that MAGA is dying, unquote. Inside the youth movement at CPAC, that's the Conservative Political Action Conference. This is by Nathan Taylor Pemberton. As the first day of the Conservative Political Action Conference wound to a close, the audience inside the airplane hangar-sized ballroom had dwindled as Nick Shirley, the headline speaker, mumbled his remarks. Mr. Shirley, a 23-year-old content creator and recently minted right-wing celebrity, had been tapped by the conference's organizers to bring a youthful jolt of energy to the proceedings. But youths themselves and their conservative energy were nowhere to be seen among the rows of empty chairs, as Mr. Shirley made halting reference to Theodore Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech. Just outside the hall, 20-somethings in rumpled suits were gathered in clusters, debating the merits of a ground invasion in Iran, the conservative backlash against those who were J-pilled, that's far-right slang for skepticism of Israeli influence, the backbreaking costs of American life, and what they saw as the slow demise of the Trump era. The majority of us, we don't necessarily come to these types of events for the speakers because generally they dish out the same slop over and over, said Jack Moore, 19, a board member of the Georgia Teen Republicans. They had come hoping to briefly escape the politics of their social media feeds and interact directly with the conservative apparatus at this year's conference, once a marquee event on the conservative calendar. Last year's meeting struck a triumphant tone as Elon Musk cranked a chrome chainsaw on stage and Trump gleefully recounted the tale of his first political comeback. But for the past several years, a younger crowd has declared the event passé. At the four-day conference in Grapevine, Texas last week, young conservatives willing to take a gamble on this gathering found themselves marooned in a listless and, with the exception of Mr. Shirley, older gathering of Trump loyalists, MAGA B-listers who preferred to avoid the white-hot debates about the future of the party. These speakers largely stuck to a tame script, sounding their support for the president's war in Iran, whipping up culture war reactions over things like Sharia law, and denouncing the infighting being stirred up by high-profile figures in the MAGA movement. Even Stephen Bannon, the former Trump advisor known for his fiery attacks against fellow conservatives, alluded only obliquely to the glaring issues hanging over the conference. In a short speech on Thursday, Bannon downplayed Trump's abandonment of his No New Wars campaign pledge and the conference's low-wattage conservative lineup, which most noticeably was missing Trump. Yes, there are a great many people who couldn't make it, Bannon said in his remarks. They either didn't want to come or they're tied up running wars and looking after the country, or playing golf, I add. It doesn't matter. You came. This is the power of the movement. For all the talk of MAGA infighting and rifts, including over subjects like the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and Israel, many young people in attendance seemed to feel that the starkest split in the party was generational. Said Aidan Hofsis, 19, who had traveled from Maine to attend his first CPAC, there is a divide between the young and old in the party. We keep hearing these talking points that we're all united in the same movement. That couldn't be further from the truth. I feel like I have closer views with liberals than more conservatives at this point. Those views, he noted, revolved around issues such as education and health care. It's not fair for someone to graduate college and have $100,000 of debt, he said. We're sending billions of dollars to other countries. Why can't we help our own people? As he avoided the scheduled events and dodged the throngs of older conservatives in MAGA-themed regalia, Mr. Hofstas had met some fellow disillusioned peers along the way. One of them was Joseph Bolick, an Army veteran wearing a bright blue America First hat, a loud symbol in conservative spaces that one is a supporter of Nick Fuentes, a 27-year-old white nationalist known for making racist and anti-Semitic remarks. It's very cultish here, said Mr. Bolick, 30, who was attending CPAC for the first time. It seems like boomers are just on this Trump train, he added. After talking with other young attendees at the conference, Mr. Hofstas said most appear to be aligned with Fuentes, who has become a pariah within the conservative movement for, among other reasons, his recent declaration that young conservatives should express their displeasure with Trump's military strikes on Iran by voting for Democrats. I'd say at least 60% of the young people here are fans of Nick. The subject of the war in Iran, a source of consternation for many young people in the crowd, was engaged with lightly on the main stage and otherwise relegated to exhibition hall gimmicks, such as gauging support for the conflict with piles of pinto beans. Matt Gaetz, the former congressman from Florida, offered one of the loudest moments of dissent with Trump in the event's official proceedings. Said Mr. Gaetz, a ground invasion of Iran will make our country poorer and less safe. It will mean higher gas prices, higher food prices, and I'm not sure if we would end up killing more terrorists than we would create. The speech, though, drew a muted response from the crowd, and some remained frustrated. Those conversations are just not happening here, said Samantha Cassell, a 27-year-old Republican strategist. She was wearing a Fishback for Florida hat in support of the rage-baiting Florida candidate for governor who has energized a coalition of young voters in that state. There's no serious discussion going on, it's just flat. I've gone to a lot of these events, the RNC, the DNC, and this is probably the worst one I've ever been to. Some on the far right saw in this generational division an opportunity to claim a young cohort looking for an outlet. Joel Webban, an online influencer who promotes a brand of nationalism infused with Christianity, wrote that his attendance at CPAC last week revealed one major finding. The youth are ours, he wrote in a post on X. Elijah Schaefer, a far-right commentator who could be seen roaming the halls at CPAC on Friday in an all-black suit, wrote on X that CPAC 2026 has given me hope for the American youth. Every young man and woman here are all radicalized. Among the young Republicans, there were cases of people expressing forms of cautious optimism about the coming midterm elections and tentative support for the president's abrupt choice to attack Iran. But these views were expressed for the most part by attendees with professional aspirations to work in GOP circles. The yawning alienation shared by CPAC's young conservatives extended to those with more moderate tastes as well, however. Like their more extreme peers, these traditional conservatives expressed an exhaustion with MAGA's culture war provocations, Trump's penchant for chaos, and the new class of content creators like Mr. Shirley, whom they saw as offering a shallower mode of conservatism. They need to touch some grass, said Jack Greenberg, 23, who participates in social meetups hosted by the Dallas Young Republican Club. Mr. Greenberg, a Trump supporter who works as a real estate developer, expressed dismay that policy had largely been abandoned in favor of rage bait. He laughed as he recounted his meeting with a young content creator at CPAC who claimed to have infiltrated Antifa. I just want politics to be boring again, he said. One thing discussed by many young attendees was how Turning Point USA and its yearly gathering, America Fest, appeared to have displaced CPAC as the movement's center stage for hashing out the party's future. Last year's event, held in Phoenix, was the scene of dramatic infighting between conservative influence over subjects ranging from Israel's influence to the place of nativism within the party. While many of America Fest's young attendees found these squabbles to be similarly distracting, CPAC's attendees yearned for some of that energy. Without it, people like Ms. Cassell felt that there was only one obvious conclusion to reach about the state of Trump's conservative movement after this past week. I think that MAGA is dying, she said. I do. Here's an interesting article about someone that I've been calling Thoreau. And the title is Rethinking Thoreau. We've been mispronouncing his name for centuries. This is by Sarah Lyall. Jeff Goldblum was in the recording studio voicing the title character for the new PBS documentary, Henry David Thoreau, when something unsettling happened. The script called for him to utter the great man's name for the first time. Naturally, he said it in the usual way, Thoreau. No. Let's do that again, one of the directors said. That was when Goldblum learned that, like everyone else, he had been mispronouncing the name of the author of Walden and Civil Disobedience his whole life. It turns out that the accent does not belong on the second syllable, as in Merlot or Poirot. It rests on the first syllable, like Thoreau, as in like thorough, thorough, as in I am thoroughly confused by this strange turn of events. Roro, or actually thorough. This front-loaded pronunciation has apparently always been there, hiding in plain sight in the halls of academe, even if no one told us about it. There is a consensus that thorough is the correct way to pronounce it, said John Kusich, co-president of the nonprofit Thoreau Alliance. But somehow Thoreau, here Kusich uttered the word the common way, got into the culture, and it's in the water to pronounce it that way. The 3-episode documentary, which premieres on March 30th, was produced by Ken Burns and the Eagles musician Don Henley, a lifelong Thoreauphile and the chairman of the Walden Woods Project. The film focuses not just on Thoreau's 2 years at Walden Pond, the famous I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately part of his life, but also on his significance as a canonical figure in American culture and philosophical history through his writing and engagement with urgent issues like industrialization, war, slavery, the environment, and the individual's relation to the state. The film's directors, the brothers Eric Ewers and Christopher Lauren Ewers, were just as surprised as anyone to learn, upon hearing an expert pronounce Thoreau's surname in their presence, that despite growing up in Massachusetts, they too did not know the right way to say it. It was a bit of a shock, like falling into an alternative reality. Though they had made a short film for the Walden Woods Project several years earlier, they said the issue had never once come up. It really wasn't part of the discussion, Christopher said. Then came the new documentary where the scholars they consulted had strong views about the subject. Here we were headfirst into a world where people were saying, thorough. Faced with this disturbing new information, they had to impart it in turn to the actors that they'd hired for the documentary, including Goldblum, George Clooney, the narrator, and Meryl Streep, who provided the voice for several women in the film. Being actors, they took the direction. It was a hotly debated thing, and it came to a head with Meryl Streep, Eric said. She said Henry David Thoreau, and we said the correct pronunciation is thorough, and she said, are you going to explain it in the film? And we said, no. He added, same with George Clooney. He was like, okay, thorough, though he slipped a few times. How the two dueling pronunciations, the correct one and the one all of us have always used, came to exist is the result of an odd confluence of historical events dating back several hundred years. Thoreau got his name from his grandfather, Jean Thoreau, a French Huguenot who was shipwrecked off the coast of New England just before the American Revolution and decided to stay put, settling in Boston and then Concord, Mass. Jean's surname was duly New Englandified by his neighbors, said Laura Dessau-Walls, a professor emerita at the University of Notre Dame and the author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life. People aren't used to seeing that name. It's not a New England name, and they pronounce it Thoreau, she said in an interview. So did the man himself, judging from ample contemporary evidence. Quick break. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. For instance, there's an 1860 journal entry from Thoreau's neighbor, Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott. Comes Thoreau and sups with us, Alcott wrote. He is rightly named Thoreau, the pervading Thor, the sturdy sensibility and force in things. And in a 1918 letter from Edward Emerson, son of Thoreau's friend Ralph Waldo Emerson, we always called my friend Thoreau. The H sounded and the accent on the first syllable, he wrote. When Thoreau died in 1862, his preferred pronunciation reigned supreme, Walls said. But matters were complicated by a surge of foreign interest in his writing in the late 19th and early 20th century. This was spurred in part by the attention of a British socialist named Henry Salt, who became a devoted Thoreauvian, firing his staff, selling his property, moving to a small country cottage, giving up meat, and throwing himself into social justice causes after discovering Thoreau's essays. The foreign attention sparked a renewal of interest back in the United States, creating a false, as it turned out, assumption among new audiences about how to pronounce his name based on the spelling. This is happening through print culture, so people are seeing the name rather than hearing it, Walls said. When you see that EAU ending in English, you want to emphasize it, and so people assumed it was pronounced Thoreau. We are not the first generation to grapple with this thorny issue. John McPhee addressed it in a 2003 New Yorker piece. Despite Thoreau's own declaration that he who can pronounce my name aright is entitled to my love and service, McPhee reported not everyone in his hometown in Concord, Mass. Was pronouncing it right 150 years later. Thoreau, shouted a resident of Thoreau Street when McPhee asked her how to say her street name. Scholars say that if you wander around Concord now, you will still find people saying it the right way. The matter arose again in the 2017 documentary Henry David Thoreau, Surveyor of the Soul. Here in Concord, we say Thoreau like furrow, but most people say Thoreau's, said J. Walter Brain, a Concord landscape architect and Thoreau scholar. Both pronunciations are actually technically incorrect, at least from the French perspective, he adds. The proper French pronunciation would be Thoreau, with the TH pronounced as a hard T and an accent on neither syllable. But here we are now, confronting news akin to learning that our first president was called George Washington, or that Marcel Marceau pronounced his last name, to the extent he pronounced anything, Marceau. Thoreauvians know that this is hard for us. Their response often takes the form of a kind of nimble code switching, using one pronunciation when speaking to general audiences and another when speaking to scholars. I think it depends on where your first loyalty lies, said Kristen Case, whose writings on Thoreau include most recently Henry David Thoreau's Calendar, Charts and Observations of Natural Phenomena. She has opted to take the road less traveled, at least by academics. I put my stock in the regular way, she said. Thoreau, like a layperson would say it. Hearing people say Thoreau reminds her, she said, of the scene in the film Manhattan when Diane Keaton loftily pronounces Van Gogh, not Van Gogh, the way most English people say it, but the Dutch way, Van Gogh, as in Koch, but more phlegmy. I'll add a footnote here. My wife's brother once was talking to her, and she said Van Gogh, and he said, it's Van Gogh, don't you know that? And she said, noch. The issue also arises when English speakers drop the name of a foreign city into their conversation. Do you say you're going to Florence or to Firenze? What about the classic Barcelona conundrum? To use or not to use a TH sound in place of the C as a way to show off your cursory command of one form of Spanish pronunciation. And if you find yourself in a theater courtesy of Samuel Beckett, who would you rather wait for, Godot or Godot? How to pronounce words that are derived from another country, it can sound quite pretentious, Goldblum said, but it depends on who's using or misusing it. He used as an example his wife, a French woman who is eager to pass her language on to their children, even in the midst of an English sentence. Whenever she comes upon a word like genre or chaise longue, she pronounces it in her native way, he said. If you watch the new documentary, you will hear thorough pronounced both ways, even though the Ewers brothers established thorough as the house style, so to speak. No one is being sent to pronunciation prison over this issue. The purpose of the film is to celebrate the man and his experiences and his contributions, said Eric Ewers. The point is the relevance of thorough. Here he fudged it a bit, of Henry, and what he's able to enlighten us about 150 years later. And here's an editorial, a guest essay, and it's by Yonatan Tuval, a foreign policy analyst. It's called, Is It 1914 in America? 4 weeks into the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, one conclusion is already difficult to avoid. Our leaders preside over an extraordinary machine of destruction, but they remain strikingly obtuse about human beings, about their pride, shame, convictions, and historical memory. The war's architects appear to have assumed that killing a nation's leaders, dominating airspace, and destroying infrastructure would produce regime collapse in Tehran and strategic clarity in Washington and Jerusalem. Instead, Iran, though badly weakened, has managed to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, drastically widen the war's economic radius, and force Washington into the old, unglamorous business of soliciting Allied help after entering a war confident that it would be swift and decisive. It is tempting to describe this as a failure of intelligence. Technically, it is not. The spycraft kind of intelligence behind the war planning and execution is extensive. Recent reporting suggests that Israeli intelligence spent years penetrating Tehran's traffic cameras and communications networks and build what one unnamed Israeli source described to CNN as an AI-powered target production machine capable of turning enormous volumes of visual, human, and signals intelligence into precise strike coordinates. That is an extraordinary achievement of surveillance and targeting. Yet, never has so much been seen so precisely by so many people who understand so little of what they are seeing. A system can tell you where a man is. It cannot tell you what his death will mean for a nation. Such systems are trained on behavior, not on meaning. They can track what an adversary does, but not what he fears, honors, remembers, or would die for. This is the recurring illusion of over-equipped leaders. Because they can map the battle space, they think they understand the war. But war is never merely a technical contest. It is shaped by grievance, sacred narrative, the memory of past humiliations, and the desire for revenge. Those are not atmospheric complications added to an otherwise technical enterprise. They are what war is about. So the familiar errors appear. The war planners imagine that a regime can be decapitated into collapse, whereas external attack often does the opposite, binding a battered state more tightly to a society newly united by injury, humiliation, and rage. They imagine that destroying conventional assets would settle the matter, as if legitimacy, wounded sovereignty, and collective anger were secondary rather than the war's actual terrain. Planners who took their adversary's self-understanding seriously, rather than discounting it as propaganda, might have anticipated that an attack would not weaken the regime's narrative, but instead fulfill it. They might also have foreseen the paradox that systematic decapitation does not produce negotiators, it removes them. The military theorist Karl von Clausewitz long ago recognized the delusion of reducing war to a kind of algebra. War, as he understood it, is never merely calculation. It is saturated with passion, uncertainty, and political purpose. The algebra has grown more sophisticated, but the delusion is just as dangerous today as it was in the 19th century. What this war exposes then is a failure not only of strategy, but of literacy. Literature and history at their most serious train precisely the faculties these leaders lack. the capacity to grant that other minds are not transparent to us and are governed by purposes not our own. A mind tutored by history and literature knows that actors in the grip of a sacred cause tend to mean what they say, and that bombing a founding myth is more likely to consecrate it than to dissolve it. Cultural knowledge, of course, rarely prevents the catastrophes of war. Athens, at the height of its golden age, sailed for Syracuse and lost an empire. Thucydides spent the rest of his life explaining why. The generals of 1914 were cultivated, well-read men, but those qualities did not save Europe. What has changed is not that culture once prevented blindness and no longer does. It is that culture has increasingly ceded authority to systems that mistake information for understanding and speed for judgment. Shakespeare understood this blindness better than our strategists. Macbeth is not merely a play about ambition. It is about a man who catches sight of a possible future and mistakes that glimpse for a license to force events to conform to his interpretation, and then watches that interpretation devour him. Soon he ceases even to pretend that action should wait on understanding. There are things in his head, he tells his wife, that must be acted ere they may be scanned. That is done before they can be thought through. Modern targeting systems promise the same fantasy in technological form, to collapse the interval between seeing and striking, to eliminate the pause in which judgment might still enter. Macbeth acts not after deliberation, but instead of it. That is the pattern one can glimpse in this new war, and it is precisely the pattern that literary and historical imagination exists to counter. Tolstoy traced the same pattern from the other side. In War and Peace, he depicted Napoleon, nourished on Plutarch's Lives and its portraits of greatness, who marched through Borodino to Moscow and still could not fathom a people who would let their city burn rather than submit. His error was not tactical, it was imaginative. He could not credit the Russians with a logic that was not his own. That's the mistake the architects of this campaign are repeating. A leadership that has spent decades framing resistance to American and Israeli power as a religious obligation will experience military pressure not as a reason to capitulate, but more probably as a reason to endure. The more technologically sophisticated war becomes, the more dangerous it is to place it in the hands of people untrained in irony, contingency, and the darker constants of human nature. Such leaders will speak fluently of capabilities, timelines, and kill chains. They will have no language for resentment, dishonor, loyalty, or grief, and they will discover too late that wars are made of these as much as of steel and fire. That is the illiteracy of this war. The algebra of the war makers will have been flawless, but what they cannot read, they will not have reckoned with. And here's another interesting essay. It's by Devin Gordon, who writes about sports. I haven't done much sports, but this is beyond sports. And the article is called Help, My Favorite Athlete is an Idiot. Recently, I've begun to worry that I know way too much about my favorite athlete's political beliefs. Shut up and dribble, the infamous instruction lobbed in 2018 by the right-wing pundit Laura Ingraham at LeBron James after he criticized Trump, was always a sharing on social media or their teammates' podcasts. It's starting to feel downright quaint. For pro athletes, people not famed for their astute political engagement, neutrality is all but impossible in a social media culture where every Instagram like gets spotted and scrutinized. And if you're a sports fan, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, it's increasingly difficult to maintain an ignorant bliss about which players hold beliefs that you find intolerable. That information will find you whether you wanted it or not. And once it does, you've got a decision to make. This dilemma came to a head for me this winter after my beloved New York Mets were dismantled, and according to my favorite preposterous rumor of the offseason, it was partly because political discord had split the clubhouse. The Mets, as they do, collapsed in spectacular fashion last season, and reports began to emerge about the team's souring chemistry. Mike Francesca, the peerless sports radio foghorn, got specific, saying it had to do with Trump. One side liked Trump, one side didn't like Trump. Close followers of the Mets didn't need to be told that one side was almost certainly the superstar shortstop Francisco Lindor, whose wife, Katya Reguero Lindor, has publicly criticized Trump's policies and was a member of Mayor Zoran Mamdani's inaugural committee. The other side probably included the fan favorite outfielder Brandon Nimmo, who reportedly donated money to Trump. Perhaps not coincidentally, this season, Nimmo will roam the outfield of the Texas Rangers. There's an old bit of locker room wisdom that says male pro athletes fight over only two things: women and money. Tariff policy didn't make the list, though I sure enjoy picturing Mr. Lindor and Mr. Nimmo arguing over pass-along costs. Of course, not that long ago, athletes reliably gave such boring, canned answers during pointless post-game interviews that it became a durable sports trope, which in hindsight allowed sports fandom to remain an oasis from the divisive politics of the world. Sports was even a subject around which the politically incompatible might find common ground, especially if they rooted for the same team. Now the opinions held by your favorite team's most indispensable players are nearly unavoidable and are difficult to dismiss. That's prompting fans to retreat into the same factions we're split into in every other realm of life. The New York Giants' outspoken running back Cam Scatabo had to apologize recently for opining skeptically on the existence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The Brooklyn Nets forward Michael Porter Jr. shared several retrograde beliefs about women and declared that he shows women clips of Andrew Tate as a test during an appearance on a podcast affiliated with the right-wing Nelk Boys. America's Olympic gold medal winning men's hockey team couldn't even get through the jubilant post-victory phone call with Trump without inadvertently ruining the celebration for an entire gender when Trump disparaged the women's hockey team, also gold medal winners. Some of the men tried to patch things up during the Saturday Night Live monologue, but it's hard to jam broken teeth back into a smiley face. In any other historical moment, I'd never believe my Mets were dismantled because players fell out over politics, and for what it's worth, Ms. Reguero Lindor mocked the idea as a fantastical rumor. But in this moment, athletes squabbling over politics? Why would they be any different from the rest of us? The fallout from these divisions for fans can be real. An old friend of mine is a multi-generational Yankees fan, Long Island born and bred. In other words, he's exactly who you're picturing when you close your eyes and picture a Yankee fan. Yet he told me the team's entire 2025 season was soured for him after the franchise decided to hold a pregame moment of silence at Yankee Stadium after Charlie Kirk's death, conscripting all in attendance or watching from home into paying their respects to the memory of a political activist with highly polarizing opinions. My friend barely shrugged when the team later lost in the playoffs, he told me, because he'd already emotionally checked out of the season and couldn't recommit. Then there's the friend, a fellow Mets fan, with whom I've developed a soothing routine. He'll periodically text me the name of a favorite player who he just discovered to his horror is MAGA. I'll text back with a reality check. They're all MAGA, which isn't true, but if you follow Major League Baseball long enough, it sure starts to feel true. He'll reply with a sad emoji. He's in Los Angeles, I'm in Boston, and this has become our bonding ritual, our bicoastal do-si-do. It's also part of how he processes the guilt required to go right back to rooting for those particular players, at least while they're in the uniform of the team he adores. He and I understand that none of us need to surrender our convictions and clap like performing seals for someone whose beliefs or behavior offends us. Nor should we require ourselves to root for someone's individual failure at the expense of our chosen team. Because here's the thing, it's still just sports. There's an old Jerry Seinfeld joke about how pro athletes change teams so often that diehard fans of a particular team, the Mets in my case and in his, are really just rooting for clothing. Maybe he was onto something. Just root for the jersey and not necessarily the nitwit wearing it. And if your conscience still can't be assuaged, go on social media and unfollow everyone on your favorite team's roster. Because trust me, you don't want to know. And I forgot to say that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Network, service, whatever. Okay. And we'll conclude with some letters to the editor. These are about the No Kings protests. This is by Mark Goads from Chelsea, Massachusetts. In these times of chaos, disillusionment, and injustice, under Trump, those opposed to him find comfort and empowerment in coming together and having their collective voices heard. The latest No Kings protests on Saturday were a resounding affirmation not only of the disgust on the part of Americans of all ages and from all walks of life with an increasingly authoritarian, deeply divisive, and dangerously incompetent Trump administration, but also of their moral courage and clarity in wishing to do something about it writ large. However much Trump despises peaceful displays of patriotism and communal idealism in opposition to his ominous and immensely unpopular agenda, they endure, thankfully, throughout the nation. Here's a longer letter by Gary Stewart from California. The Times gave its 5 takeaways, and I've got mine. 1. The messaging was outrage, but the mood was calm yet determined. The fact that these No Kings rallies seem to be getting progressively larger is an indication of how serious this disaffection is for everything the Trump administration is doing. 2, people care enough to put in the time and creativity to create a blizzard of unique signs. This reflects a high degree of engagement. These are people who are not just showing up, these are truly civic-minded people actively protecting democracy. 3, as a physician, I was glad to see plenty of signs highlighting health concerns because of Health Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr.'s ignorant and deadly policies. I am sure that all protesters have their personal grievances that mean the most to them. There's no way this administration is going to change course to allay these fears. 4, the obvious anti-war part of the rallies showed that there is no rallying around the flag for this misguided, destructive violence and unnecessary death. The incompetence is startling, and it is sadly evident that Iran's asymmetric war plans have Trump flailing in his ignorance. 5, the momentum of this pushback against looming fascism is not going away and will only build further all the way to November. These folks are leaving these rallies energized to canvass, donate, text, register, influence elected officials, and do everything that needs to be done to lock down the midterms and flip Congress. And a letter by Sally Peabody, who lives in Peabody, Massachusetts. I am part of a robust network of more than 200 elders who organized our local No Kings demonstration in Danvers, Mass. It goes without saying that the mocking response of White House sycophants to the No Kings rallies is utterly demeaning to the diverse millions of Americans who care deeply about the evisceration of our democratic republic, the rule of law, and the Constitution. President Trump, we've got news for you. We disrespect your blasé attitude about the potential global economic destruction from your uninformed war of choice. We find your racist mass deportation agenda costing untold billions repugnant. Your endless law-breaking is horrifying. We are watching your attempts to disrupt the midterm elections. No Kings encompasses many concerns and issues. That is precisely its genius. We are millions, and we are paying close attention to your lies and abuses of power. A letter from Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. No Kings continues to grow, including in red states, precisely because it is inclusive and its organizing principle is simple. We are led by a criminal, inhumane, and anti-democratic president and his lackeys, to the eternal shame of our nation. That's unifying principle enough for millions of us. And a final letter from Seattle. My favorite sign at the No Kings protest in Seattle on Saturday was held by a young girl. It said, "I'm only 10, and even I know better." And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I hope you enjoyed it, that it wasn't too depressing. I enjoyed doing this and talking to you every week, and I look forward to speaking with you next week. Thank you for listening. Have a great week. Bye.